Hey folks, Dave, got your full in-depth review on the Apple Watch Series 8, in particular with the sports and fitness kind of slant to it. I've been putting this watch through its paces, running and cycling and swimming and indoor workouts, as well as of course WatchOS 9, which is probably the biggest change on this watch. This includes doing a triathlon and a deep dive into the running power. And we'll get to all that in just a moment. The first thing to know though is that the Apple Watch Series 8 is $399, or it starts there anyways, $499 for the cellular edition. That's a bit more than the newer updated Apple Watch SE, which is $249, but of course less than the also announced Apple Watch Ultra Edition, which is $799. And don't worry, I've got reviews for both those watches planned, just hang tight a tiny bit longer. Now the Series 8 is a relatively modest change when it comes to hardware. It's got two kind of minor changes in it. The first one is vehicular crash detection using some new sensors in there. So if you get in a crash, it'll go ahead and notify emergency services automatically if you don't respond. And the second piece there is a new wrist-based temperature sensor. Now that wrist-based temperature sensor is only tracking your temperature at night while you sleep. It's not doing the rest of the day. And it's only doing it relative to your existing baseline. So you have to spend 5 days first getting a baseline, and then from there, it'll give you kind of the relative difference to that baseline. Now there's basically two core scenarios here. The first one is that you have female health tracking on particular ovulation cycles. Apple will retrospectively go ahead and try to figure out your ovulation dates based on that data, based on your kind of temperature data. It's something that we've seen Aura and Whoop do as well over the last year. But in their cases, they also do it forward-looking, and they can predict your period and your cycles based on that. Apple doesn't do that today. I think, long-term we'll probably see that, but certainly not today. The rest of the changes, though, come from Apple WatchOS 9, which is the WatchOS platform that Apple Watches run, and it's getting rolled out to the vast majority of Apple Watches out there today. And with this update, there is a massive new slate of sports and fitness features, especially in that endurance sports realm. For example, there's new heart rate zones that are now showing your workouts. You've got more expanded data field customizations. So for example, you can add running power and running efficiency metrics on your running workouts. You can go ahead and get multi-sport mode now for triathlons. You can track a full triathlon. It'll even automatically transition you from swim to bike to run, though there is also a manual transition option as well. And then they also added editable structured workouts. So you can create your own structured workouts on there, for example, doing 4x800 or 8x800 or whatever you want on the watch itself. That's not something that's available yet on the phone to create, and we'll talk about that in just a second as well. So the first thing to dive into is basic activity tracking. And none of this has changed since past Apple Watches. You've got still the rings concept, meaning that you look in your watch and you see the rings that you need to complete for the day. There's 3 colors of rings. Each color has a certain area that it's focused on. Standing, exercise, or moving. Basically moving is their proxy for steps, but it counts more than just steps. And of course, all these things are shown on the watch itself, as well as on the companion app on the phone. That companion app on the iPhone is called Fitness, and yes, it does require an iPhone, just in case I didn't mention that earlier on. All the Apple Watches do. It does not work with an iPad by itself, and that's because the data goes into the Apple Health app, and that app is only available on the iPhone and not on the iPad or a Mac or something like that. So that kind of requirement does still continue for all of this year's Apple Watches as well. The Health app is the underlying database app, if you will, that Apple has for all of their health data, but not just their health data, anyone else's health data. So weight scale data or other sensor data can all be piped into that from other manufacturers as well. You'll see data from Garmin in there, and Polar and Whoop and Oura, and all these companies are spitting data into Apple Health, which can then be pulled out and shown in the Fitness app or by other third-party apps for other purposes. And hey, just a quick note that if you are finding this video interesting and useful, if you can hit that like button at the bottom there, it really does help out this video and the channel quite a bit. With the Apple Watch Series 8, in particular via WatchOS 9, you now have sleep phase and sleep stage detection. So that'll show you what it thinks are its best estimates for sleep phases and sleep stages. And you can see that data on the watch itself when you wake up each morning, but then you can also see that data within the Apple Health app. This is something you'll see in the Fitness app, but it comes in the Health app. And then from there, you can plot that over different time periods, for example, weekly or monthly or every 6 months. And you can see your trends against that, as well as other data points like respiration rate. And it's in here that you'll also see that wrist temperature data showing up in the Apple Health app. Again, it does take that 5 initial days, and then from there on out, it'll give you the relative differences to the baseline. Now, when it comes to me judging sleep data accuracy, I don't tend to focus on the sleep stage and phase data. And the reason for that is that the comparative tools that you have out there to do that are only about 80% accurate in judging that sleep phase and stage data. So I don't think it's really fair to judge any wearable on something that's really not all that accurate in the grand scheme of things. Instead, I'm focused more on are the sleep times accurate. And the Series 8 mostly gets that right. In terms of the time I went to sleep and the time I woke up, those are correct. But the total times displayed there are a bit funky on some of my days, and last week in particular, on the most recent version of WatchOS 9, where it's had this like buffer at the end of like an hour or two after I've woken up, but I've moved off to the desk and haven't quite exactly like moved out the room, and it just classifies this as like null time. Like it doesn't know what to do with that. It's like it might be sleep, it might not be sleep. It's just here. On days where I immediately get out of bed and go off and go somewhere, then it's like really crisp and clear, and it just ends that sleep right there. So next, let's go into the workout side of things. To do that, you're going to open up the workout app. It's a little runner icon there. And then with that, you got all the different sport modes to choose from. There are plenty of sport modes, and then each one of those sport modes has like sub-sport modes, if you will, or sub-different categories of ways you can execute that sport. So if we open up the run, for example, you see there's an open run, which means I'm just going to go off and run as long as I want. But you can also have runs of different goals, or you can go down to the new structured workout option. This is where you can create your own structured workout. You can add a warm-up and a cool-down, as well as certain work intervals or recovery intervals, and even repeats if you want to. You can get pretty flexible within this. And then each of those workout types can also support custom data pages for it. So you can have multiple data pages and multiple data fields per page of your customization. And in particular on WatchOS 9, one of the new features is the ability to add running power data as well as running efficiency data, plus the new ability to add heart rate zone data as well. You can customize these heart rate zones, and you can actually do that on the phone as well. However, notably in WatchOS 9 and iOS 16, as of this recording, you cannot customize any of the data pages, data fields, or sport types on your phone. You used to be able to in iOS 15, but that feature is now gone. My guess is it just didn't make the cut for launch, but hopefully we see that back, because it is kind of cumbersome to do all this stuff on your watch versus having the flexibility to do it on your phone as well. Now, once we start this workout, you see all this data on your watch as you're running along. You will see that running power data, the running efficiency data. If you're in a structured workout, you'll see the distance until each one of those workout segments is complete. For example, in that interval, if you're running a 400-meter interval, you'll see that data for that particular interval, and you can swipe between the data pages to go to different pages. I haven't had too much of an issue swiping between data pages. It is super hot out here right now, as you probably can start to see the sweat building here, and I've gone out for runs in this weather. It was 105 degrees the other day out for a bike ride, and I can still swipe through even with my gloves on my mountain bike. No real problems there. It's not always perfect, and it's not quite as easy as having more buttons. Now, once your workout is done, you'll go ahead and save it. You'll see a quick summary on the watch, but the bulk of the data is actually in the Apple Fitness app, and it's here that you can see all these new metrics. It's got way more depth than it used to from the Fitness app, but of course you can also export it out to third-party platforms. In my case, I use a third-party app called HealthFit. It basically spits out the data to pretty much any platform I want. Certainly though, there is native integration from the Strava app itself and from like the Training Peaks app to pull your Apple Watch workouts straight into those platforms, but HealthFit does a better job of it in terms of all these added data metrics. Now, before we transition into the compass stuff, one last thing to mention is that from a sensor standpoint, like a sports sensor standpoint, the Apple Watch can pair natively to heart rate sensors, so Bluetooth heart rate sensors, no problem, but it is not natively paired to Bluetooth power meters or to Bluetooth cadence sensors. So if you have that from a cycling standpoint and you wanted to use the multi-sport triathlon mode, you're kind of out of luck. There are third-party apps that go ahead and allow you to connect to a power meter, but none of those apps, to my knowledge, also support multi-sport triathlon workouts. So you're kind of like in this weird gap right now. I'd like to see Apple add Bluetooth power meter support and Bluetooth cycling support. Certainly they referenced Ironman triathlons in their keynote, and in doing so, the vast majority of Ironman athletes today are using a power meter, if not at least a cadence sensor. So that kind of gap there is a bit odd as we go forward and they try to be more competitive with the Garmins and the Choruses and the Suuntos of the world. Now, before we dive into the accuracy of all those metrics, let's talk about the compass and the backtrack functionality. So the compass has been revamped in WatchOS 9, and it comes to the Watch Series 5 as well as Watch Series 6, but only Watch Series 6 and above get the new waypoints and backtrack feature. So assuming you have one of those new watches, once you open up the revamped compass app, you'll see the compass as you expect, but at the very bottom there's two new kind of buttons. The bottom left-hand side is the waypoints button. This allows you to save an exact waypoint, your exact GPS coordinates, give it a name, give it an icon, color, whatever you want. So backtrack does not actually start automatically. It only starts when you either manually press it or when you go out of cellular service or away from denser Wi-Fi signal. So basically tries to kind of smartly figure out when you're leaving. The idea being that if you just get lost, you may not have planned to get lost. And so in that case, if you don't have cellular coverage or don't have any sort of Wi-Fi coverage, that's where it wants to protect you. Personally, I would love to see this started any time a workout is started in the background, just so you always had it there, but nonetheless, that's the way it works. Now within that, it'll go ahead and lay these points every 2 minutes as you're going along, and it's just going to connect the dots using a line. So it's not as detailed as you would see from most of their competitors in the endurance sports realm, but in terms of like getting you out of a pickle, it can do that. Like you can certainly follow the directions back on these every 2-minute lines, and outside of being like in a gigantic snowstorm, it'll work just fine. You can of course also see on there all your previously saved waypoints as well as your starting location. And these are waypoints that could have been saved like a year ago. As long as it was saved at some point, it'll show up there. So if you come back back to a city or go out to a different place, many months later, those same waypoints will still be there. Again, this is all fairly basic compared to most of their competitors, but it's a pretty giant leap forward for Apple to have this feature natively. Now with that, let's go ahead and dive into the accuracy of the GPS data, the heart rate data, and some of that running power data.
So the very first data set here is an interval workout inside, and you can see it's basically spot on with a chest strap. So they're going outside. In this case, I've got a run, relatively steady state, but with some sprints in there. Very, very solid from Series 8. A couple bobbles from the SE, but we'll get to that in a separate review. And this is a run mostly in the forest under trees, and overall looks pretty good at a high level. One minor caveat though, if you zoom in there, this little section, you can see the Series 8 went off into the bushes about 50 to 75 meters. This is the only time I saw this, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. Next, we've got another interval workout I did last night, spot on again with the chest strap, and the GPS track here was super, super clean. I went out and back on something that should have been super easy, and it absolutely nailed the out and back, so they're exact same track both directions. Now check out the cadence from that run. That green line there is the cadence sensor on the Garmin, and you can see it's very, very abrupt because I'm basically walking each time. Versus the Apple Watch pretends to kind of slow down and sort of smooth the data way too much. It's not correct. It's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but I suspect that is part of why, if you look at running power, that's an area where they do not do that when they're walking, because it just doesn't have the accuracy there. And here's actually running power from that same run. And you'll notice the two Apple Watches roughly match with the Garmin a lot higher. Keep in mind, there is no standard for running power, and so each company does things differently in terms of what they do and do not include in those algorithms and the calculations. So in this case, we are seeing those differences, but they are at least consistent to each other. I've got an entire video on the Apple Watch running power up in the corner there that you can check out with way more data in it. Now, completely unrelated to that, I want to show you this mountain bike map. This is basically a section I went back and forth a gazillion times doing some action cam testing compared to the Garmin Edge 1040 Solar, which has dual frequency GPS. And you can see these tracks are almost identical within just a couple meters. It's super impressive. And then looking at the elevation from that plot, the entire ride in total, it's very, very close in terms of how they align, but they're offset by about 12 meters, which is somewhat normal when I compare barometric altimeters across multiple devices. Ultimately though, if you look at all the data I have for especially heart rate and GPS, things are looking pretty solid here on the Series 8.
Now, one final feature to note is there's a new low power mode on the Apple Watch Series 8. And that mode's split into kind of two categories. The first piece is for non-workout usage. And that shuts off a bunch of things I'm putting on the screen right now that gives you more extended battery life. Basically doubles the battery life from the claimed 18 hours up to 36 hours. But then in workout mode, it also extends things as well. And despite what some people think, as of today, it does not reduce the GPS fidelity or the heart rate fidelity or any of the data metrics that are captured by the watch itself when in low workout power mode. Instead, that's all about the general watch things like shutting off the display and cellular and stuff like that, where it saves battery. However, later this year, Apple's going to be introducing an update that allows a secondary low power workout mode that does reduce the frequency of GPS and heart rate to save even more battery life. And that, of course, I will test in detail and see how it all works later on this year. Okay, so wrapping things up here, where do we stand? Now, certainly from a hardware standpoint, the Series 8 is a very modest upgrade from the past, as I mentioned. So if you've got a Series 7, it's probably not worth the upgrade to a Series 8. There's not enough new features there for most people to justify that. If, however, you've got something like a Series 3 or an older watch, then it makes a ton of sense to upgrade to this. It's a much better experience, not just in terms of the hardware and the always-on display, but also all the software features of WatchOS 9 that you'll be getting. And that is probably the biggest shift that you'll see going from those older watches to this. As far as how it compares to something like a Garmin watch, it gets really messy really quick when you get into the details. This is unquestionably a better smartwatch experience. I don't think anyone would argue otherwise. But when it comes to the running stuff and the trail stuff, that's where it sort of gets a bit complicated. So if you look at, for example, Garmin's Forerunner and Phoenix lineup, those have far more features than this does in terms of those running kind of area. But if you look at something like the Venue series or what used to be their Vivo Active series, then in those cases, this actually has more advanced running and multi-sport features than those units do. But I would say those watches still have a more cohesive kind of fitness experience in terms of the way structured workouts work and all that kind of stuff being a bit better tied into the ecosystem than the Apple Watch does. But Apple is getting much, much better really quickly here. And I think it'll be really interesting to see over the next year and a half or so, where Apple goes with all these updates, and in particular, whether we'll see them continue this trajectory of this massive slate of new sport and fitness features. With that, hopefully you found this interesting or useful. If so, go ahead and like that like button there, or hit subscribe for plenty more sports technology goodness. There is a lot of stuff coming up over the next week or a couple that you do not want to miss out on. Have a good one.